introduce our speaker. Today, we are very, very happy to have Nico Slate speak on actually a topic of which is very timely, Kamala Harris and the history of South Asian America. So this is also very timely because of the issues about anti-Asian hate that have been happening recently in the United States. On that note, we have a teach-in on May 7th, which is organized by the Office of the Vice Provost for International Affairs in collaboration with the faculty at Cornell. It's on Friday, May 7th, and it's on confronting Asian American racism. And this is a teach-in for students, staff, and faculty, and will involve two separate parts: a teach-in from 12 noon to 1 p.m. and then a listen-in from 1 to 2 p.m. And we will provide a link in the chat for people to sign up for that. I think Nico's talk is also going to look at the relationship between the question of being South Asian background, and then of course coming into prominence in a major political role in the United States, as exemplified by Kamala Harris. So Nico is a professor in the Department of History at Carnegie Mellon University. His research examines history of struggles against racism, imperialism, and caste oppression in the US and South Asia. He's the author of 4 books: Colored Cosmopolitanism, The Shared Struggle for Freedom in the United States and India from 2012, The Prism of Race, W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, Paul Robeson, and the Colored Worlds of Cedric Dover from 2014, Gandhi's Search for the Perfect Diet, Eating with the World in Mind in 2019, and Lord Cornwallis is Dead, The Struggle for Democracy in the United States and India from 2019. I think, because Nico's work addresses both issues of race and marginality in the United States and as well as in India, so we look forward to him addressing the topic today. Welcome, Nico.
Thank you so very much. It's my honor and a great pleasure to be here with you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Before I begin, I actually would like to pick up on what Iftikhar just said about this being a solemn moment. I have been personally shaken and deeply saddened by the remarkable tragedy that has been unfolding in India in particular, and to some degree South Asia more generally at this very moment. And I've also been deeply saddened by the multiple incidents of anti-Asian violence that have occurred in this country, in the United States. And I'd like to take a moment to just have a brief moment of silence to recognize and honor those who have been lost in either of these ongoing tragedies. Thank you, friends. It might seem odd, perhaps, to connect anti-Asian violence in the United States to the massive toll of the pandemic in India. But as you'll see, many of the key figures that I'm going to talk about today were remarkably bold in their thinking about the connections between different forms of suffering and struggle, particularly in the United States and India. They thought beyond the boundaries of nation, but also beyond the boundaries of other kinds of identity, whether race, caste, religion, gender, and the boundaries of struggles in thinking about how to fight for a better world. And I think in our particular historical moment, that kind of cross-cutting solidarity is badly needed. And one of the things I, as a historian, find personally very meaningful is the opportunity to learn from those of the past, to learn from their mistakes. And we will look at a variety of figures and moments that we might criticize justly, but also to learn from their imagination and their boldness. And I want to start actually not with Kamala Harris, who we'll come to at various points today, but actually with a different Kamala, who I think really typifies the bold transnational, transracial solidarity that is at the heart of the talk that I'd like to give you all. And that is Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay. In the spring of 1941, in the midst of the Second World War, Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay sat down in the whites-only section of a segregated train traveling across the American South. And just across the border of Louisiana, the train conductor approached her and Now, she could have at this point told this hapless train conductor that she was a famous Indian dignitary, friends with Mahatma Gandhi, that she had just actually been invited to the White House to have tea with Eleanor Roosevelt and the President Franklin Roosevelt. She could have told him, I'm a famous figure. I'm not African-American. Leave me alone. But instead, when the train conductor presses her and says, where are you from? She replies, I am a colored woman, obviously, and I have no intention of leaving my seat. He mutters, you are an Asian, but he doesn't bother her again. What Kamaladevi does by defining herself as colored is to form a connection between her own identity as a South Asian woman and the identities of the African-American peoples that she's connected to and form bonds with throughout much of her time in the United States. This is not a passing gesture. She goes out of her way to identify as colored, that's the word she used, as dark, as part of a large group of people across the world who have been oppressed on the part of white supremacy and who are fighting against it. And she boldly frames what I call her colored cosmopolitanism in relation to a variety of other forms of quite remarkable solidarity. Let me give you just one example from her writing. This is from a book she publishes in 1946 called America, Land of Superlatives. In that book, she writes, soon Africa too will come back and come into her own, and the dark ones will cease to be the quote unquote untouchables of the world. The international color line has been challenged and stormed by Asia. No more the colonials will allow themselves to be Jim Crowed the world over and their country looted under pseudo slogans. The Negro problem will only cease when the color line of imperialism vanishes. We see a lot here, friends. The key thing I want to pull out is the way in which her identity as a colored woman, her references to darkness and to color, allow her to form an analogy between the struggles of African Americans against racism and the struggle of Indians and other colonized peoples against imperialism. And I also just want to point out something we'll come back to, that by referencing untouchability, she also opens the door to another kind of analogy, not one between race and colony, but one between race and caste. And I'll come back to that. But for now, I want to focus on this idea of darkness or color as a bridge across the borders of race and nation. Kamaladevi takes this idea, as do many of her contemporaries, from W.E.B. Du Bois, the renowned African-American scholar and activist, who in a variety of different works and texts advances quite a remarkably complex and fluid conception of the dark or colored world. Many of you, I expect, will be familiar with Du Bois's famous statement that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. What's often forgotten is that he explicitly globalizes the color line. He's not just thinking about race relations in the United States. He explicitly pulls in struggles against imperialism and other forms of white supremacy across the world. And he inspires many other people in the United States and throughout the world to think similarly in a transnational and global sense about the struggle against white supremacy. Let me give you just one more figure, one who is the center of my second book, and as someone I think actually should be studied more than he is right now. It's a very fascinating and interesting human being who had actually his own problems we could talk about if we had the chance. That's Cedric Dover. Dover is born in Calcutta, now Kolkata, and just after the turn of the 20th century. He is of the community that was sometimes known as Anglo-Indian, but Dover preferred to identify as Eurasian. This is an explicitly mixed race community that occupied a peculiar niche, both in the class and caste hierarchies of colonial India. Dover felt very uncomfortable in that niche because Anglo-Indians were often employed as key cogs in the colonial machinery. Dover was fiercely anti-imperial. He was also fiercely anti-racist, and he's strongly inspired by Du Bois to understand his own identity as a mixed race person, as a bridge to connect to other people who are struggling against racism in different parts of the world. So he comes to the US repeatedly and forms very strong ties with a variety of different African-American figures. This is an image of him with Langston Hughes at Fisk in 1947. He becomes very close friends with Paul Robeson, with Du Bois, with Claude McKay, many other African-American artists, scholars, and political figures. And in the process, what Dover does is to connect his own identity as a mixed race man of color to the struggles of African Americans and other, not just mixed race peoples, but other peoples of color throughout the world. He advances this idea of dark or colored solidarity like Du Bois and also like Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay. Now, let's bring Kamala Harris into the story, and I'll do so at a variety of points today. Many of you, I expect probably all of you, are familiar with Kamala Harris's own ethno-racial history. Born of a Jamaican father of African descent and an Indian mother, Harris has long identified both as African American and as Indian American. Although when she was running for president, there were various articles you can still find online that questioned the relative weight of these different identities in her own self-understanding and her own narrative. My own sense is that she, actually like Barack Obama before her, tries to identify in multiple boxes, to identify as a person of mixed race heritage, as a person of South Asian American heritage, as a person of African American heritage. And in doing so, she actually taps into a long lineage of others who, like Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, like Cedric Dover, like several other figures we'll talk about later, strove to link their own peculiar racial ambiguity to the opportunity to create solidarity. And let me, I don't like to be too pedantic, but I do have a couple slides where I just spelled this out to try to make my points as clear as possible. For many of these figures, racial ambiguity, and particularly the ambiguity that is afforded by the strange conception of race that has long been at the fore in the United States, that kind of racial ambiguity can be an opportunity for solidarity. It can be an opportunity for figures like Kamala Harris, Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, Cedric Dover, and others to say, well, okay, you can't put me in any one box. Fine, I don't want to be in any one box. I'm going to create connections and solidarities with others, particularly those who are also struggling against different forms of racism and white supremacy. Now, so far, I focused on some key figures, but I do want to make a very important point we can come back to, which is that this isn't just the history of a few bold social reformers, activists, and political figures. There's a much larger history here, a social history of the experience of people of Indian descent in the United States. And that is something that many different scholars have written about. This is just some of them. I was limited by how many images I could get in one slide, but Vivek Bald's Bengali Harlem, Maya Ramnath's Hodge to Utopia, Vijay Prasad's Karma of Brown Folks, Seema Sohi's Echoes of Mutiny, Nayan Shah's Stranger Intimacy are part of this larger group of work that I see myself contributing to as well, that looks not just at the history of social activism and social reform, but also the history of migration, of large numbers of people who come from South Asia to the United States to, in most cases, not with the goal of trying to fight against injustice. That's not what motivates their movement. It's the goal of surviving, hopefully getting ahead a little bit, hopefully supporting their families, but in the process are pulled into a very complicated ethno-racial landscape in which they're forced in many different contexts to make difficult decisions about how they identify and who they might form allegiances with. And I want to pull out two potential strong conversations that can help us think about the choices that any of these different migrants made, as well as the choices that some of the key political figures, whether in the South Asian American community or folks like Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, who come from India to the US, there are a variety of different trajectories that their choices map upon. And let me just highlight two that will. One is the tension pioneer. That is always in tension with an alternative conception of whiteness. There's always a tension between colored cosmopolitanism and South Asian Americans trying to claim whiteness. And we'll see that unfold over time. Similarly, there's always a tension between analogies between race and caste and analogies between race and empire. And I noted that in Kamaladevi's comments when she references untouchability. That's also something we'll come back to over time. And let me give you one example of someone who tries to opt for whiteness. Some of you will be familiar with this history. Akhay Kumar Mozumdar comes to the US and is one of the early South Asian American figures to successfully gain American citizenship. He becomes a naturalized citizen at a time when there are only two paths to doing so. You either have to demonstrate, prove that you are of African descent, or you have to prove that you are, and the legal word that was used is white. You had to prove that you were white. Now, what did that mean for someone who was like Mozumdar coming from India? Well, it meant falling back on certain pseudoscientific, and at that time they were just scientific conceptions of Caucasian or Aryan identity, conceptions that were simultaneously racial and also strongly based in conceptions of caste. Let me give you a quote from Mozumdar's legal files. He declares, in trying to convince the judge that he is in fact white, he declares the laboring class of South Asians, those who do the rough manual labor, are not high caste Hindus at all, but are in an entirely separate class, having quite a different religion and a different ancestry. The high caste Hindus always consider themselves to be members of the Aryan race. That racial and caste argument is actually quite successful for several score South Asian Americans who were able to convince various judges that they are in fact white. That history of success ends in 1923 with a famous Supreme Court case many of you will be familiar with concerning Bhagat Singh Thind, a US Army veteran. This is his official US Army photograph, who, like Mozumdar and like many others, appeals to certain caste and racialized conceptions of Aryan identity in order to claim whiteness. In his legal files, you can find this statement: the high-class Hindu regards the Aboriginal Indian Mongoloid in the same manner as the American regards the Negro, speaking from the matrimonial standpoint. And these sorts of claims and arguments had proven quite successful. But in 1923, the Supreme Court decides, no, we're not going to accept those conceptions of whiteness anymore. The common man knows that those who are from India are not white, therefore you're not white. And not only did Thind lose his case for citizenship, but many others, including Mozumdar, had their citizenship retroactively stripped away. This is a very traumatic moment in the history of South Asian America because citizenship was at that point tied to a variety of other legal rights, including the right to own land. So many South Asian Americans, for example, in California, where there was a lot of losing not just their citizenship rights, but also their property that they had worked very hard for a long time to build up. It's a very difficult moment. What happens is that the numbers of South Asian Americans constrict dramatically because those who weren't able to prove citizenship are also restricted in various ways from entering the country. But slowly over time, over the course of the 1920s and 1930s, an active political movement, I can talk more about that, fights back against this conception, and slowly South Asian Americans are able to regain their right to citizenship, regain other political rights as well. But their racial standing remains ambiguous. Let me give you another, I think, quite rich example of this. This is from a book that was produced in the 1940s that was aiming to convince Americans that as a foreign policy imperative, segregation, particularly segregation in Washington, D.C., had to be ended. The argument here is that we couldn't preach democracy to the world and at the same time have all of these foreign diplomats harassed in our nation's capital. And you'll notice that the graphic gives you a variety of different foreign diplomats that are, or other foreigners who are harassed in various ways. But it's only the quote unquote Hindu woman who's refused a service at a soda fountain that gets an asterisk explaining at the bottom, quote, dark-skinned foreigners are often embarrassed. The reason for that asterisk is because many readers will know that often visitors from India or South Asia are immediately identified as not African-American and thus not subject to the usual forms of Jim Crow. In fact, in this particular incident, what happened is that the so-called Hindu woman explained, oh, I'm not African-American, I'm from India. And at that point, she was offered service as well as an apology. So there were, at that point in time, often escape routes, if you will, for those from India that allowed them to sidestep the worst strictures of Jim Crow segregation, particularly, and this is a very interesting point we can come back to, particularly in the American South and on the East Coast. On the West Coast, the story was quite different because on the West Coast, the animus against South Asian Americans had long been framed not within Black-white relations, but rather within the terrible history of anti-Asian violence and racism on the West Coast. So if you were on the West Coast of the US, for example, wearing a turban would not help you avoid racism. In fact, it would elicit it. Whereas on the East Coast or in the South, often wearing a turban allowed you to sidestep racism. And here's a cartoon that brings that to mind. It's a little blurry, but it says, it's all right to seat them. They're not Americans. In other words, these dark-skinned visitors to this restaurant would normally be refused service based on the racial codes of the day. But because they're recognizably foreigners, the man wearing a turban, the woman wearing what appears to be a sari, they're allowed to enter. That escape hatch is noticeably different from the escape hatch of whiteness. And you'll see that there's a long history of tension between South Asian Americans trying to escape American racism by claiming whiteness as versus trying to escape it by claiming Indianness. These are alternative paths to finding a way beyond or around or through American racism. The paths don't often work, but in some cases they do. And we could talk at length, I expect, about figures like Nikki Haley, who have managed to garner remarkable political success in the American South, no less, often in ways that could be, I think, understood within the long history of claiming whiteness. So whether or not Haley has done so, and some of you will be familiar with the minor controversy that arose regarding her driver's license application in which she was required to check her racial identity. There's a large question here about what it means to claim whiteness in our moment in time. A question that relates to names, the names that people go by, how they identify, and also the stances that they take on politics. And we'll come back to this in regards to Kamala Harris. But I do want to point out that in our world today, as all of you know, but I think it bears repeating, being Indian or being recognizably seen as a foreigner is no defense against racism. Tragically, there are many examples of South Asian figures in the US being targeted precisely because they're seen as foreigners. Many of you, I hope, will recall Srinivas Kuchibhotla, who was tragically killed. Now it seems like a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago. And the man that shot and killed Kuchibhotla later told authorities that he thought he was killing someone from Iran. He thought he was killing a Muslim. What we see in that instance, and we've seen it tragically many times in regards to Sikh Americans in particular, is the way in which South Asian identity in the US is often mistaken for some kind of generic foreignness, often associated with Islam and often demonized because of that. So what it means to be racially ambiguous in this country continues to shift over time. There continue to be opportunities for solidarities, but there also continue to be a range of dangers. I want to turn for a moment from focusing on the tension between colored cosmopolitanism and whiteness to looking at the long history of tensions between race colony versus race caste analogies. But you'll see there is a link here. One way to connect the link is to look at the figure of Lala Lajpat Rai, the renowned Punjabi anti-colonial activist who comes to the US actually twice. At one point stays for multiple years. Lajpat Rai is, I think, a very fascinating and interesting figure. In some ways, you can hold him up as an exemplar of transracial solidarity. He forms very strong ties with Du Bois, for instance, speaks out against American racism. When he writes a book about the US, he includes a chapter about African-American society and African-American struggles. And yet, his connection to whiteness and to caste are somewhat ambiguous. Within the context of India, Lajpat Rai is pretty outspoken in opposition to untouchability and to some degree in opposition to caste. But in the US, it's a more complicated story. He's, for example, at various junctures identifies Indians as Aryan in order to advance claims for citizenship. Also, although when he at one point writes in one text that the condition of African Americans is equivalent to who he calls the pariahs of India, those who we would now refer to as Dalits, often also at that time referred to as untouchable. He equates the struggles of African Americans and Dalits and says that both struggles are needing of support, that both injustices need to be addressed. About 10 years later, in response to a terrible screed, we can talk about Catherine Mayo's Mother India, he shifts his analogy and says instead that in fact, the condition of African Americans is worse than that of a pariah. Again, he uses that word pariah. And what you see here is Lajpat Rai shifting his assessment of relative injustices in order to make a point, in this case, a point about the hypocrisy of an American, Catherine Mayo, suggesting that India is a backward society while ignoring American racism. But Lajpat Rai is taken to task for the way he ranks these hierarchies by none other than Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, a figure that I hope all of you are already familiar with. Ambedkar, of course, had himself come to the United States for studies at Columbia, and had formed his own connections to African Americans and African American struggles. He writes Du Bois, for instance, suggesting that there is some opportunity for solidarities between Dalit struggles and those of African Americans. And Ambedkar responds to Lajpat Rai by saying, no, in fact, although African Americans face tremendous forms of racism and injustice, the oppression of Dalits in India is in fact even worse than the oppression of African Americans. So you see Lajpat Rai and Ambedkar both ranking hierarchies, but doing so in a different way. What I conclude from all this, friends, is actually the importance of looking at context and trying to make sense of how these historical analogies were deployed, because Ambedkar, in criticizing Lajpat Rai, is writing specifically for an Indian audience, whereas Lajpat Rai is writing specifically for an American audience. And so in this case, I find both of them justified in using the analogies in the way they do, because what Ambedkar is trying to do is to convince an Indian audience that they have to take caste seriously. And Lajpat Rai is arguing to an American audience that they have to take race and racism seriously. Even though they're using the exact opposite analogy, they're doing it in a way, in both cases, that I would argue are trying to advance justice. Let me give you one more South Asian American figure, someone who, unlike Lajpat Rai, unlike Ambedkar, really makes the United States his home for a long period of time. And that is Tarak Nath Das. Das is a very remarkably interesting figure, someone also who I think we should know better. There's going to be a wonderful biography coming out, hopefully not too long from now. Thus is a radical anti-colonial figure who spends a long period of time on the American West Coast fighting both against American racism and against British imperialism, but also spends time on the East Coast. And one of the most remarkable things about him, if you look at his long trajectory, is that he comes to a pretty fierce anti-racism that he holds on to even when pressed. And let me just give you two examples. In 1927, he writes, "In the Anglo-Saxon world, a new caste system based upon race hatred and color prejudice has arisen, which is going to poison human relations." So like Kamaladevi, he uses the idea of caste as an analogy for racism and imperialism, and thus sort of links all of these different forms of injustice and oppression and stands against them. And in 1943, he says, quote, "Since the American people declared that they did not believe the superior race theory of the Nazis, there should be no discrimination against any individual because of race, creed, or country of origin." Note that what he's not saying, we Indians deserve special treatment because we're connected to whiteness, because we're foreign. He's saying we need to fight against all forms of racism, including racism against African Americans. I focus my talk so far today on South Asian figures, but I do just want to note my own work looks at the connections between South Asian and South Asian American figures and African American activists and figures who were forging their own kinds of transracial, transnational solidarity. Let me just give you a few examples very briefly. This is one of my favorites, Pauli Murray, who almost at exactly the moment that Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay is on that train in Louisiana, the very early 1940s, Murray has her own experience in public transit. She is harassed and arrested on a bus traveling across the American South. The story is very rich, and I could go into detail if we have time, but I just want to share some notes that she takes at that moment in thinking about how to respond to her arrest. These are notes that she takes in March of 1940, in which she draws up this really remarkable chart comparing the struggle of India against British rule with the struggle of African Americans against racism. She draws up a variety of compare and contrast analogies here, many of which I will point out actually suggest that the struggle of Indians is more. For example, the first thing in the chart notes that Indians are a majority, whereas African Americans are a minority. And yet, Pauli Murray still concludes that African Americans could and should take up nonviolence in the struggle against American racism. Now, all of you will be familiar with Martin Luther King's debt to Gandhi. A lot of my work is trying to broaden our understanding of this long relationship between South Asian and African American freedom struggles. The Gandhi-King relationship often eclipses figures like Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, Lajpat Rai, Ambedkar, Pauli Murray, and many others that form their own links across these divides. But I will say that King's connection to Gandhi deserves a lot of study. It's very rich, and King's own connection to India is not just based on nonviolence, but also on colored cosmopolitanism, on a conception of darkness linking African Americans to anti-colonial struggles throughout the world. It's a conception that's firmly rooted in a broader awareness amongst many African Americans about the colored dimensions of British imperialism. Let me give you just one example of many from the African American press. This is a cartoon that comes out in the wake of, in the midst of the Quit India movement, in the wake of Gandhi's arrest in the summer of 1942. You see Britain, egged on by prejudices, attacking Gandhi's spinning wheel. And at the base of the spinning wheel, this is, I think, the most important point here, the base of the spinning wheel, you see freedom for colored peoples. So that the idea here is that Gandhi's struggle and the struggle of India is not just for Indian independence, it's also for the freedom of the colored world. This is a complicated history, friends. If we have chance, I can talk more about the experience of the some 20,000 African-American soldiers that go to India in the Second World War. But because today is focused on the South Asian American experience, I want to bring us back to a couple more examples from that history before concluding. We're moving towards the end here, friends, and I look forward to your questions. There's so much here that I'm passing over quickly. hopefully provocatively, so that we can have a conversation. Let me just give you a few more examples that will bring us back to Kamala Harris. This is one of my favorite photographs. It was shared to me by one of the young men on the edges of this photo. Obviously, I hope you can all recognize Martin Luther King, and standing next to him, Coretta Scott King. The two other figures at the center of the photo are also extremely well known in the history of India. The man is J.B. Kripalani, longtime socialist figure and an anti-colonial freedom fighter, and his wife Sucheta Kripalani, who's also a renowned Indian anti-colonial activist and political figure, who actually in the history of post-independence India has much more success electorally than her husband, in part because she stays within the structure of the Indian National Congress. The two folks on the outside are Jaswant Krishnaiah and Ahmed Mehr, who are both students at this point of Indian descent at MIT, who learn about the struggle against racism in the American South by reading newspapers and decide that they want to join. And so they head south, very few contacts. They pack a tent, a huge jar of peanut butter, and they end up connecting to African-American civil rights activists, not just the Kings, but also a variety of young people in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This is another remarkable photo of these Indian MIT students sitting in a room at Morehouse College in Atlanta with the Kripalanis, with the Kings, and with a group of young SNCC activists, all talking about how they could bring nonviolence from India into the struggle against American racism. And there's a long history of South Asian figures who are willing to take up that struggle. Let me give you just one more example. This is of another famous Indian socialist, Rammanohar Lohia, who comes to the US a couple times. In 1964, on his last journey, he's arrested. This is a police photo that gets, an AP photo that gets picked up by newspapers across the country. Lohia arrested in 1964 in Jackson, Mississippi, after being refused service at a segregated restaurant. The history is very rich and intricate. The key thing I'll point out here is that this is an example of the way in which visitors from India are often connecting the struggles that are advanced by those that are based by South Asian Americans who are based in the US. Because in fact, Lohia is arrested in Jackson only because of the activism of a Indian American professor and a Pakistani American professor, both of whom taught at Tougaloo, a historically African American college, who had for months been working with the African American students to challenge segregation in various ways, such that the establishment Morrison's, and you can see Morrison's there in the image, Morrison's had issued a very unusual edict in the history of Jim Crow segregation that closed their restaurants, not just to African Americans, but also to people of Indian descent. And they did that just before Rammanohar Lohia comes to town and gets arrested, and suddenly it's national news. So what we see here is actually a link between figures like Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, who are coming to the US for brief stays, and someone like Kamala Harris, who is of South Asian American descent and lineage. A link that is, I think, actually extremely important for us to bring into the light at this particular historical moment. As many of you are aware, Kamala Harris, now as vice president, has been often challenged to do more for the struggle against racism in this country. As a prosecutor, she was part of a criminal justice system that I would argue, and I think many others have argued persuasively, is fundamentally connected to the legacy of white supremacy. And in that role was, and this is an interesting question we can debate, to some degree forced to participate in the perpetuation of those structures, while at the same time trying to fight against them. And I think for me, the key question moving forward is how Kamala Harris as vice president, perhaps as president one day, will be able to tap into the long history of struggles against racism in this country, but also against other forms of injustice and oppression, whether white supremacy, whether caste in South Asia, whether sexism, and we can talk more about gender, or any other forms of oppression and injustice. To what degree she'll be able to use her own unique identity in order to help advance these kinds of solidarities in the way that Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay and many other of the figures we've touched upon have done. So friends, I'm a historian. I'm always safe for talking about history, but I did purposefully raise some questions about the present and the future. And I look forward to fielding your questions about any and all aspects of this talk. Thank you all very much. And I look forward to hearing from you now.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Nico, for the very insightful presentation. If people can type their questions or comments in the chat. And let me begin with the comments already posted. This is from Dom Matz. Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste starts with an example when Martin Luther King visited a school in the southern state of Kerala, and the principal of a school introduced him as a fellow untouchable from the United States of America. I'm curious if this link that this was cited has carried over in recent Black Lives Matter and anti-police protests, especially in light of the model minority tags that differentiates between us.
That's an outstanding question. Thank you for it. Let me point out first that that particular incident that Wilkerson cites is a bit more complicated than her rendering of it. I've written a bit about this, and Daniel Imawar, another historian, has as well. In fact, King, when he cites that incident of being identified as a fellow untouchable, is drawing upon a narrative of one of his key mentors who had actually come to India several decades earlier and had that experience. It's an example of many in which King, in his speeches, draws upon the writings of other African-American scholars and clergymen. Some of you will be familiar with the debates about whether this constitutes plagiarism. My own view of the matter is that it's really beside the point. There is a long tradition of Black preachers and other preachers, for that matter, drawing upon others' texts and speeches without directly citing them. What's interesting, though, if you look closely at that history, is that whereas King's mentor had told this story about being identified as a fellow untouchable and focused more on the identity of being subject to Jim Crow as versus the identity of being subject to caste oppression in India, King actually deepens that by looking at structural forms of racism and of casteism when he sort of extrapolates on this experience. If you look at King's speech, and I recommend you to, it's very rich and interesting. What he does is says, at first I was sort of shocked by being identified as an untouchable, but then I thought about all of the hotels that are closed to me, all of the different forms of Jim Crow establishments, and all of the rat-infested slums of the United States in which my people suffer. And so what King does here is he uses this race caste analogy to expand the way that people understand racism in the US, and to suggest that when we think about racism, we shouldn't just think about overt forms of Jim Crow. We should also think about the structural inequities and inequalities that are still sadly so much prevalent in our world today. Anyway, that it's important to pay careful attention, I think, to the way in which these race caste analogies are deployed. To answer your question here, yes, there are actually many examples in our current moment at which African-American activists within Black Lives or outside of it are drawing these kinds of analogies or connections. And it's also coming from the other direction as well. There's active efforts on the part of Dalit activists to form these kinds of solidarities. Many of you will be familiar, at least to some degree, with the Dalit Panthers, which is a very rich moment in time in which a group of Dalit activists, primarily in today what would be known as Mumbai and Bombay at that point, create an organization that is explicitly based on the legacy of the Black Panthers. So there are many examples of both Dalit activists within India and African-American activists trying to forge these solidarities, trying to deepen them. What I think King's experience reminds us to do, and this goes back to that history of Lajpat Rai and Ambedkar I talked about, is to pay very careful attention to how these kinds of analogies are deployed. My own view is that the key thing is to deploy them in a way that advances solidarities and helps open up a deeper understanding of what these forms of oppression mean. It's too often in this country, in the United States, we have an incredibly impoverished understanding of racism, one in which, racism is just about prejudice in our brains, and that it has to be explicit in order to have an impact. Whereas I think we can usefully deploy a race caste analogy, and Wilkerson, I think, tries to do this, in order to deepen and broaden our conception of racism. And the opposite is also true. I think it's absolutely important that when people in the United States think about the struggle against racism here, that we don't just stop at the borders of the US, but we also think about the long history of solidarities between anti-racist struggles here and struggles against caste or other forms of oppression throughout the world.
The next question is by Nima Kudwa, and I'll read it. Nico, thanks for a really wonderful talk. I was really uncomfortable with the way Wilkerson used caste in her book, and think Appadurai's careful review of the book touches on one aspect of why people like myself were left troubled by the book and its enthusiastic embrace by so many in the US. But moving on to my question, there is another perspective on racism and transnational and racial solidarities that emerges from the Caribbean. I'm thinking Glissant or Stuart Hall. How would you see these strands of thoughts vis-a-vis the Indian and African American activists and thinkers you've picked on today? Just curious to hear if this is something you have considered.
Well, that's a wonderful question. And yes, and actually, like the previous question, let me first address the commentary on Wilkerson. It is a book that has been responded to by so many, and then I want to address your question as well. I'll say that I've read several very thoughtful critical reviews of the text. Another one I would suggest is Sunil Kilnani's review as well. I think that it's very important that we think both about the way in which Wilkerson can advance these conversations, but also the way in which that text does so in some problematic fashion. So if the chance arises, we can talk more about that. But I agree with you. There is some need for critical responses there. In regards to the Caribbean, it's such a rich and fascinating history. One thing I'll note just on the social history front is that the large numbers of Indian migrants to the Caribbean, many of whom were indentured laborers originally, to places like Trinidad, for example, and elsewhere, that their experience in the Caribbean, it overlaps in many ways with the experience of South Asian Americans, particularly on the West Coast of the US, where they faced their own forms of racism and where it was often hard to forge solidarities with people of African descent, precisely because the colonial and capitalist structures often played these different communities against each other. And sadly, there are still tensions between people of Indian descent and people of African descent in these various cultures and societies. In Southern Africa, you see this as well, and in Eastern Africa too. You see many examples of tensions where South Asian migrants are often put in the difficult position of serving as colonial intermediaries or of competing for various resources with those of African descent. But at the same time, you do find many examples of figures, whether Afro-Caribbean or Indo-Caribbean, who are actively trying to forge solidarities across these communities and doing so in quite rich and compelling ways. But I will say, in my experience, rarely in terms of notions of color. I actually went to Trinidad at one point to try to look in the archives there to find if I could uncover examples of what I call colored cosmopolitanism, this notion of ideas of darkness or color as an explicit transracial bridge. And I didn't find much. And then later I had a bit of more of a clue into this when I read the Spanish translation of a very famous book on within the literature of feminism of color. The book, this Bridge Called My Back. Many of you will be familiar with this. It's a very important book in the history of feminism of color in this country, in the US. When it's translated into Spanish, the authors have to sort of go out of their way to explain why they use the idea of color as a form of solidarity. In the US, right, when we talk about people of color, the idea of that phrase goes all the way back to Du Bois as an effort to forge solidarities. But conceptions of color in the Caribbean or in Latin America are much more often tied to colorism, which is, of course, an issue in this country and very much an issue in India as well, where color isn't a form of connection, but rather a way of ranking people, right? With light-skinned people being seen as, in the case of India, often higher caste or higher class, right? And darker-skinned people being discriminated against in one fashion or another. So even though there are, I think, very rich and interesting efforts at solidarity in Latin America and in the Caribbean in particular, rarely have I found them in regards to color, because in those societies, color is so often a divisive and hierarchical force, rather than, as it's been, at least sometimes in this country, as a form of connection. These are wonderful questions. I usually try not to talk at such length, friends, but it's very difficult to contain myself when you ask such big and important questions.
So another question, which is by Arko Dasgupta. Nico, studies which center the African American and Indian working classes tellingly stop around the early to mid 20th century, when Gandhi and the Indian National Congress became more or less Black America's diplomatic focus in South Asia. Eventually, on the other side, Martin Luther King comes to dominate the story, and we are told of a continuity between the struggle of Gandhi against the British and Martin Luther King against American white supremacy. There is no disputing the centrality of Gandhi and MLK in the story of racial solidarity forged between Indians and African Americans. However, an overemphasis on the two has obscured fraternal ties between Black and brown folks stretching back to the 19th century. Vivek Ball's Bengali Harlem is an example of a study that tells us more about this. How might new historical scholarship correct the conventional obsession with Gandhi and Martin Luther King?
It's a wonderful question. And I would say that there are many different, very rich historical veins that need to be tapped in trying to get us beyond that obsession with Gandhi and MLK. And as I said earlier, I think there's a reason for that obsession. Martin Luther King's connection to Gandhi is actually much richer and more interesting than is often conveyed. It goes far beyond nonviolence, and both of those figures deserve attention. But Arko, you're absolutely right. There's so much more to this history. And it has been touched on by a variety of historians, but there's still so much more good work to be done. One way to think about this, I think, is to think about the other connecting threads. So we've talked a lot about colored solidarity, which is at the center of much of my historical research. Of course, nonviolence is the thread that most often connects King and Gandhi, and there's a tremendous amount of research on nonviolence. But what about the race caste analogy? There's still a lot more to be done there. What about gender as a point of connection? My own studies into the history of Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay suggest that there's a tremendous richness to the way in which gendered conceptions of struggle, whether in South Asia or in the US or in other parts of the world, can form very rich and compelling bridges, alternative paths of solidarity. Then they had their own complexities. Kamaladevi is very critical of what she sees as the failings of Western feminism, very critical of the way in which many Western feminists, particularly in the sort of first half of the 20th century, are bound up with particular kind of neo-colonial narratives. And yet there is still so much to be found in the way in which a figures like Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay form bonds between different women's movements in India, in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere. Kamaladevi spends quite a bit of time traveling through Asia, traveling in Africa, trying to forge ties between these movements. So I think, and if I know we're close to time, but I would also say, you mentioned the left. We've talked about color, we've talked about nonviolence, talked about caste, we've talked about gender. Class and the left are another huge avenue for thinking about the way in which different people try to conceptualize these forms of solidarity. It's not a mistake that many of the figures I touched upon, including Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, Rammanohar Lohia, J.B. Kripalani, these are all socialists, figures for whom a certain conception of class inequality, Cedric Dover as well, Du Bois as well. These are all figures who think a lot about class and the way that class also cuts across these different forms of identity. So there's a huge amount of work left to be done in exploring these connections. And I hope that those who are on this call that have the time and the interest, I hope that you can all join in. There's still so much to be done to understand the many layers to this history, and then also to link those many layers to our contemporary struggles.
If I may ask a question. So when in the 60s, when immigration opens up again for South Asian, how does that change? I mean, you have another generation of kind of, South Asians who are coming here, many of them of, people of privilege, but also people who are working class and so on. Yeah.
That's a wonderful question. I'll say that the 1965 Immigration Act is a huge surprise for almost everybody. When it's passed, nobody is aware of just how much it will dramatically change the story of migration to this country, but it does change it dramatically. And the two main ways, many of you will know this already, but the two main ways it does that is by opening up preferences for people based on opening up preference based on Iftikhar, to your point here, because there is a huge preference put on professionals, and it hugely skews the migration flows, so that whereas if you look at who's coming to the US from India in the first couple decades of the 20th century, well, it's mostly working class Punjabis, not the most poor people. They have to have some resources in order to make the journey. But also certainly not affluent middle-class people. It's mostly folks that end up as farmers, as laborers, working in lumber mills, et cetera. That changes dramatically in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, where because of US immigration policy, you have large numbers of engineers, doctors, professionals of other kinds coming into the US. And it directly contributes to what someone noted in the chat is, referred to as the model minority myth, the idea that South Asian Americans are the model minority because they're so educated, so affluent, et cetera. That narrative conveniently forgets that there's a huge selection bias at play here. And I should say, friends, just passingly, I don't discount at all the tremendous hard work and the strong drive for education and for both personal and familial and cultural advancement that defines the history of South Asian America, particularly in this later period. But I also think we have to keep in mind, particularly when the South Asian American community is compared to other ethnic communities, the role that immigration selection has played in framing that community's narrative. And then the model minority myth itself, it connects to the very complicated and ambiguous trajectory of the racialization that Indians and Indian Americans and other South Asian Americans have faced. And this is where the difference between Indian American and South Asian American actually becomes very important, right? Because of course, starting in the 80s and then very strongly in the 90s and even more so after 9/11, South Asian Americans in general, when they are racialized in the US, are often racialized within a kind of pseudo-racial conception of Islam, right? That is coded as negative, as dangerous. And you see the attacks on Sikh Americans that are tragically still ongoing in this country. Part of this long history, dark history, in which race and religion overlap in our conceptions of who is or should be an American. And I will just say that the model minority myth is not a good protection. It can protect people in certain contexts and certain times. This goes back to the long history of whiteness. There are instances, I think, in which a political figure like a Nikki Haley, a Bobby Jindal, and maybe even to some degree, a Kamala Harris can benefit from the way in which Americans view South Asian and particularly Indian Americans in a positive light. There can be some benefit to that, but there are also still many racialized prejudices at play that that continue to bring the long history of not just Asian American bias, but I think in this case also specifically anti-Muslim bias to bear against all South Asians in this country. And what are we to do from that? Again, I'm a historian, but I do feel that the only solution here, friends, from my vantage point, is to create solidarities of resistance against white supremacy and other forms of racism and inequality. I think what the long history of South Asian America teaches me is that when you try to claim benefits for your own community by distinguishing yourself from others who are struggling, it's not just unethical, but it's ultimately impractical. That it's more effective and more ethical to follow in the footsteps of figures like Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, figures like Tarak Nath Das, who try to reach across these divides and to forge solidarities of resistance to fight for a better world for everyone.
Thank you. Are there other comments, questions, observations?
I see one more question here from Daniel regarding, yeah. I'll let you read it. I'll let you read it.
Yeah. Several South Asian Americans in the early 20th century, whom you mentioned, claimed whiteness by appealing to their alleged Aryan heritage. But what about South Indians? Besides Kamala Harris's mother, have you found examples of similar solidarities?
It's a really rich and interesting question and an important one. When I actually came to study India many, many years ago, I came through the beautiful portal of the Malayalam language. I spent many years studying Malayalam and visiting Kerala, and have long been interested in regional variety within India and South Asia and how that plays out in the US. In the early history here, I haven't found any examples at which regional difference on the part of South Indians. I haven't found examples of South Indians who identify as such in a way that distinguishes their experience of being in the US. And some of that is just based on numbers. The South Asian American community in those early decades is overwhelmingly Punjabi, and then to some degree also Bengali. There are lots of, this goes back to Vivek Bald's work, so lots of Bengali merchants who come, also to some degree some scholars who come. There just aren't as many folks who come to the US from South India. And compare that, for example, to the huge migrations of South Indians to Southern Africa, to the Caribbean, right, where they're very strongly represented population-wise. So some of that is just a question of numbers, but I think it's a very important and interesting story moving forward in that post-1965 period. And this is where any young historians here in the group, there's a lot of important work to be done in the post-1965 era of South Asian migration. And I think a lot of that work is going to be looking at the importance of regional varieties, because there is a huge difference between, for example, the Gujarati American community and their experience, the experience of Tamil Americans. And often it will intersect, region will intersect with questions of religion, right? A lot of, not all by any means, but a lot of the Malayalis that come to the US are Christian, who then form very interesting connections. There's some really interesting scholarly work on churches that tend to have Malayali Christians with, say, Latino or Latinx Christians. And with Islam as well. Islam is a very interesting bridge. Many South Asian Muslims end up, participating in religious communities with Muslims of other ethnicities and descents, including African American Muslims. So there's a variety of cross-cutting kinds of identity, and region and language play in different ways. But I haven't found any good examples of South Indians who come at that moment where Aryan identity is so strong and then have to grapple with their own identity. I would love it. If anyone finds any, let me know. I would find that really quite compelling and rich, but I haven't come across it myself.
So in the case of Islam, I think Malcolm X, as well as Muhammad Ali, the boxer, and were also important figures of kind of affiliation and so on. I remember growing up in Pakistan, and Muhammad Ali was a big hero, in Pakistan, and people used to watch, his matches eagerly, follow his career.
Well, and many of the most important Muslim scholars and teachers within the African-American Muslim community come from either British India or later from Pakistan. There's many examples of figures who come over and play an important role, whether in more traditional mainstream Islam and Islamic communities in the US or in the Nation of Islam, which, as many of you know, has a complicated relationship with many other Muslim communities. But there was a strong effort within the Nation of Islam, both when Malcolm X was involved and later as well, to connect to the global world of Islam in South Asia and elsewhere. So yeah, that itself is a rich history. When Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay comes to the US in the 40s, she actually ends up bumping into a community of Black Muslims in New York who are, via her connection to some Indian Muslims that have sort of served as teachers and advisors as well. So there's a long history that goes back well into the 1920s and 30s of Islam serving as a bridge between South Asians and African Americans.
And Ahmadi missionaries also, Ahmadiyya missionaries.
Yes, absolutely, are very important. Yes, very important in that history.
Well, further thoughts, questions, anyone? Okay, so I thank you, Nico, for this really stimulating talk. And there's a question, Nico, are you writing a book on Kamaladevi? This is from Nima.
Yes, I am. That's probably, I should have said that, but I'm glad you asked. I am indeed. It's right in the middle of the forest, if you will. When you're writing a book, you have to walk through a forest of the research to eventually climb the hill where you can sort of see the larger view of everything. But right now, I'm just overwhelmed by the richness of her life and what it tells us about the long history of all of the things we've talked about today, as well as the long history of struggles within India itself. So yes, thank you for the question.
Nico, for your stimulating talk. Thank you for everyone for attending, and please attend our future events as well.
Thank you, Iftikhar. It's been a real pleasure. I am honored to be here, and thank you all so much for joining us.
Bye-bye.